First of all, let me start by saying that's a very hard act to follow. Number two, having been an employee of the University of California system for 17 years, I'm so glad Jagdeep is managing my pension and putting it to right use. And you'll hear from him, and you'll agree with me. So I thought I'll just put a context to this discussion. And I'm going to talk about innovation, because that's the bread and butter of the United States. If you look back at the 20th century and look at all the innovations that have happened, starting from airplanes to electricity, to space applications, to polio vaccination, to the internet and the transistors and lasers, all in between, that all happened in the United States and really enabled the rest of the world. And I think that's why we call the 20th century the American century. But it's in a global context. That's very important. And I think as we're facing the challenges of not just the climate change, but access to energy as well, we got to think of it in a bold, dynamic way. So I'm going to just set the agenda, or at least a framework for the discussion. So let's go back in history and see where we are. We're talking, I think Jennifer was talking about jobs, and that's really about the growth of our economy, the GDP growth, which is a good thing. Our population is also growing. In fact, we are 7-point-something billion now, globally. We're going to be about 10 billion by the end of this century, with an uncertainty of 10 billion. So we really don't know exactly. The economy is very well correlated, the growth, with energy use. Without the energy, you just can't grow the economy. And as we know, it's been, for the last 250 years, mostly about fossil energy. And as a result, the greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions are going up. And these are called the global exponentials. And what we're trying to do is to turn that around. We like the GDP growth per capita to be exponentially growing. We like that. But we don't like the other exponential growth is the CO2 concentration, which is also growing exponentially. So the big question, if you step back for a moment, the big global question is, how do we decarbonize our energy system and continue economic growth? If we could figure this out, and that's really the global challenge, and the United States should be leading that in the world. Number two, and this is a bit of a misnomer, I would say it's a little timid. Climate change is happening now. Climate change is accelerating. And if you look at this latest study on sea level rise, the sea level rise is accelerating. And I put the numbers out there. I don't call it good, bad, and ugly. No, it's bad, worse, and ugly. And that's the level of sea level rise that's going to happen by the end of the century. And in between, in our lifetime, we're going to see this happen. And if you think that Superstorm Sandy had a really adverse effect, it's going to be even more in the future. And that kind of sea level rise, if you know, the 10% of the population is along the seacoast. So this is a big, big deal. And this is just one issue. You heard about the tropical disease, the drought, all of this is an issue. So I think while we are trying to decarbonize our energy system and while continuing economic growth, we got to think about how do we adapt to climate change, because it is already happening. That's number two. Number three, talking about the global context, and we have a role to play in this one, is that we have about 1.5 billion people who do not have access to electricity and enough energy. And so the big question that we have also is, how can we enable access to affordable energy for economic development for billions of people? And frankly, our economic growth is tied to that as well, because once they increase the Human Development Index and their GDP growth, that's tied to our GDP growth. And so these are the three big issues. And I would say we need to go back to our bread and butter on innovation. And this is innovation not just in technology, writ large. So I'm going to invoke a great American philosopher who seemed to have retired. I don't know why. In these times, he would be, I think, very instrumental, and talk about And this is not, as we know, not one technology, but it's not 100, so I'll just pick a number of 10. So this great American philosopher is David Letterman. And he has always came up with this top 10 list. So if you were to think a little longer term and ask the question, what are those game-changing innovations that could happen? And I'm talking about technology, I'll talk about the financial and the market, et cetera, as well. What would they be? Now, I'm not going to talk about all 10, but I'm going to use that as a way to frame the discussion. There are 10 of them. Everyone should have the pet 10. These are mine. This is about carbon capture at very low cost, photovoltaic systems that are ultra cheap, electricity storage, nuclear energy, building energy efficiency writ large, using carbon dioxide, turning carbon dioxide into oil. If you could do that in a renewable way, wouldn't that be fantastic at $2 a gallon? I'm not going to go deeper. I mean, if I were to, as a scientist and engineer, if I were to go deeper, this will take a lot of time. But I'm going to pick storage. If we could figure out, because this cuts across all those three big questions, if we could figure out how to make electricity storage at less than $100 a kilowatt hour, it will change the ballgame not only for decarbonizing our electricity grid, but also addressing resilience in our electricity system, as well as enabling a lot of people around the world to have access to electricity in a very meaningful way. So I'm just going to pick one. And even at this, I know a lot of people know about the whole energy innovation process, the journey that someone takes. But I know it may be redundant to some, but even at the sake of redundancy, I just want to put it out there because I want to show you that there are some gaps in our ecosystem that needs to be filled, and I hope the next administration really takes this upon themselves to fill them. So this is a busy curve, busy graph plot, and I'm going to walk you through this. Any technology has to scale. If it does not scale in the energy business, it doesn't matter. And if you look at, plot cost over performance as one and scale at the other, all technologies fall with some learning curves. And along that y-axis is risk. And that's where capital investment has to consider that as well. So today, if you take any technology, let's say lithium-ion batteries or today's air conditioners, whatever that may be, it has a learning curve. That is, the more you do, the cost comes down. And this is based on research. This is based on various cost of capital reduction, all kinds of things. The cost slowly comes down. And so this is current technology. There's also the technology which will be disruptive. And we rather have the disruption come from within the United States than coming from the outside. And these are new technologies, and the goal of the new technologies is not to be just a new technology, it's to reduce cost so that it becomes more affordable and is better performance, providing new services. That has to happen in the long term. And of course, when you take on these new technologies, this is risky business. This is where the government comes in. This is where organizations like ARPA-E were funded. And this funding goes to places like Stanford and Berkeley and MIT and many other places. This is where the research is going on. So if, let's say, someone out here in a lab in McCullough in a building comes up with a way to make an aluminum air battery. I'm just taking this because this battery, the energy density is as much as hydrocarbons, in fact, slightly larger. If someone can figure this out, what is the journey it will take? So this is a lot of research is going on, and you got to take multiple shots at goal to have a portfolio approach, and these crosses are ideas that just don't work out. I call them opportunities to learn and go back to the starting block again. But this is what is funded, the R&D that Secretary Schultz was talking about, but federal and sometimes state government. But the federal government is predominantly. So this is where what I call proof of concept and perhaps a proof of system, and that's the amount of time and dollars it takes. This is what the federal government does. This is what Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, they do. Then it's the proof of scalability, because if it doesn't scale, as I said, it doesn't matter. There's some pilot demonstration. This happens in large and small corporate labs. This is in the private sector, because it's very hard to do scalability and pilot in a university. That's not the role of the university. Then is the question of if it really meets all the standards of lowering cost and being high performance, you got to create a supply chain. You got to have regulatory compliance and further cost reduction. This is in the private sector. It's a large corporation, a small corporation, or a partnership of that. And I put a little cloud, and I'll come back to that. And then, of course, there are products and services and market adoption and what we call deployment. This is where this happens in the large corporations, where federal and state tax policy, whether it's investment tax credit, production tax credits, the project finance, private public capital. I know Dan Reicher is going to talk about the master limited partnership, which will bring private capital in this business in clean energy. So all of that comes at that stage. And finally, then, of course, there has to be markets. And the markets have to be created by price. I prefer price and carbon. On the supply side, on the demand side, there are some market inefficiencies. Markets don't work. We need to have some things like appliance standards and all, which on the regulatory side. But whatever it is a combination of the two. Now, what is missing out here? And I think there's a big thing, and hope we get to talk about it, is things that are in between. And the venture capital industry is actually withdrawn from this right now, so it's very hard to move this. So, post-Paris, what has happened? We have mission innovation, which is really government funding, and Secretary Moniz has done a fabulous job, not just in his attempt to double the budget on the energy side, on the government budget, energy R&D in 5 years. He's rallied around the world to get about 20 countries to fall in line, and they're doing that right now, which is fantastic. Then we have Bill Gates and a cohort, and including the University of California system, to come in and say, we have Breakthrough Energy Coalition. And I know we're going to get into that. And that is happening. And that is taking shape right now. And then the oil and gas companies, the top 10 companies came and said, we have a climate initiative. And then the question is, what are we missing? And we wrote, a few of us, myself, John Deutsch, Norm Augustine, and Secretary Schultz, we wrote an article, what is the role of the private sector? And I think in this one, we said that, well, if it's going to take $1 billion and 10 years to take all the way from pilot to full-scale business, that's the role of the private sector. That's a lot of money, a lot of time. Maybe they could form partnerships to be able to come together to share the cost, share the risk, and share the rewards so that you actually move the needle. Let me just finish by a few other things. We need innovations in all categories. This is not just R&D in science, technology, and manufacturing, as we just heard. Finance, MLP Parity Act is going on, and this is a tax policy. We're going to hear about it. Institutional reform. This is a lot of work that, for example, in the electricity sector, we have now, there's a big thing going on in distributed energy resources, and there needs to be some reform out there. Regulatory reform, business models, and new policies to align of them. It's very important that they're not going in different directions. They actually coherently align. This is like a laser. A laser beam is much more powerful than a beam that is going in all different directions, because a laser beam is coherent. So the coherent alignment of these innovations to accelerate the transition, and the speed has to be faster than climate change. That's the goal. That's the target. The government can do a lot. Of course, there's R&D, there's market and financial policy. We'd love to see a price on carbon, a revenue-neutral tax. And I would add a revenue-neutral tax that is starting at low level and then ramping up to give a clear, predictable signal to the business community that this is going to happen so that they can take their actions in an appropriate fashion. Enabling the states, I think Jennifer talked about that. Enabling the states is very important. Our whole electricity system is in the state regulatory system. There's a North American part that Secretary Schultz always talks about that he did not talk about today. We are blessed with Canada on the north and Mexico at the bottom, on the south of us. And Mexico has changed its constitution to enable energy, and that's enormously important, not just the oil and gas, but also the electricity sector. And this partnership in North America is really our geopolitical strength. And energy is geopolitics. And it's extremely important that we pay attention to this. And I know that Secretary Moniz is doing that right now. Convening and enabling the other nations, the United States has to play a role in the global stage to convene the other nations. And I know we have a clean energy ministerial coming up at the end of this month. Convening the private sector for partnership, the convening authority of the government is enormous. And to catalyze organizations like what we have done in the semiconductor business and Sematech and others, could we do that in the energy space? It's absolutely important that we do that. So again, you share the cost, share the risk, and share the rewards. Early adopter, I think Secretary Schultz talked about that. The biggest energy user, single entity, is the Department of Defense. Could we use them as an early adopter of some of the technologies? In current Silicon Valley language, it's called eating your own dog food. And finally, and at least this is my experience, the role of the government is not just to fund research, but to create an ecosystem of people, of a community. If you go back in the history of DARPA, when it created internet and many other things, it's not that they just funded. They created a network of people, of bringing them together, thinking in a competitive way and also in a collaborative way. That ecosystem of community building is extremely important to shepherd some technology from its early stages all the way to late stages. So this is not just a handoff. This is discussion and feedback loops across all these things that are going on. It's very important that the government enables that to happen. Finally, let me end with a quote, which I think was given for reasons that we all know, but it's so appropriate for these times. And this is from Martin Luther King. We're now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We're confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Thank you.